8 months, one narrow peninsula, and the day young men from Australia, New Zealand and Britain stepped into the jaws of death. Gallipoli was supposed to be a quick strike to cripple the Ottoman Empire, to open a gateway to Constantinople, and end the stalemate of the First World War. Instead, it became a nightmare carved into rock and memory. It began with bold ambition in 1915. The Allies, desperate to break the deadlock on the Western Front, turned their eyes to the Dardanelles. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, believed that one daring campaign could change the war's fate. If the Ottoman Empire fell, the Allies could open a supply route to Russia and crush Germany's ally in the east. It was a plan that looked brilliant on paper. The first phase was naval. Massive British and French warships steamed into the Dardanelles, their guns pounding Ottoman fortifications, but the sea was a graveyard waiting to claim the unwary. Hidden mines and relentless artillery fire tore into the fleet. 3 battleships sank within hours, and the naval assault faltered. The sea, once the Allies' great strength, had turned against them. So the plan shifted to the land. The men who would make history at Gallipoli were called to embark on one of the most daring and doomed landings of the First World War. The Australians and New Zealanders, who had trained under the sun of Egypt, were young, proud, and untested. They boarded troop ships with rifles in their hands and songs in their throats, unaware that they were sailing toward a legend written in blood. As dawn broke on April 25, 1915, the first landing craft cut through the dark waters toward the steep cliffs of the Gallipoli Peninsula. The air was silent, except for the soft splash of oars and the distant rumble of guns. Then, as the first boots touched the sand, the hills above erupted with fire. Ottoman machine guns and rifles rained death upon the invaders. Soldiers leapt into the water, some drowning beneath the weight of their gear, others crawling through the shallows as bullets tore the sea into white foam. This was Anzac Cove, a name that would burn into history. The cliffs loomed like walls of hell, and every inch gained was paid for in blood. The young men who had sailed across the world now realized the truth. Gallipoli would not be a quick victory. It would be a slaughterhouse, and they were its first offerings. By the second day on Gallipoli, the hope of a swift advance had died on the beaches. The Anzac soldiers, wedged between the sea and the cliffs, dug frantic trenches in the rocky soil. Every attempt to climb the ridges was met with withering Ottoman fire. The defenders, commanded by the brilliant Mustafa Kemal, later known as Atatürk, understood the terrain and fought with relentless determination. The battlefield became a maze of gullies, ridges, and sniper nests. Men crawled on their bellies through thorny scrub, clutching rifles as shrapnel rained from above. A few yards gained cost dozens of lives. The summer heat baked the ground, and the stench of unburied bodies clung to the wind. Water was scarce, and disease stalked the trenches as mercilessly as the bullets. At Hellish, where the British and French forces had landed on the southern tip of the peninsula, the story was no different. From the blood-soaked sands of V Beach to the killing grounds of Krithia, waves of soldiers charged into machine gun fire, only to fall before they could even reach the Ottoman lines. Every offensive ended the same way, with bodies strewn across the ridges and the groans of the wounded echoing through the gullies at night. The Ottomans suffered too. Their trenches were little more than shallow scrapes in the hard earth, and Allied naval guns could turn any position into a furnace of steel and fire. Yet they endured, fighting with a tenacity that shocked the Allies. Mustafa Kemal's famous words to his men became the soul of the defense. "I am not ordering you to fight, I am ordering you to die." And many did, willingly, to hold the line against the invaders. Weeks turned into months, and Gallipoli descended into a grim stalemate. The peninsula became a mirror, of the Western Front in miniature, barbed wire, sandbags, and a no-man's land where any movement invited instant death. Snipers ruled the daylight, and at night patrols crept silently, knives in hand, through the scrub. Soldiers on both sides lived with the knowledge that each dawn could be their last. Then came the August offensives. The Allies, desperate to break the deadlock, launched a new assault at Suvla Bay. Thousands of fresh troops landed on broad, sandy beaches with little resistance. For a brief moment, hope flickered, but hesitation and poor leadership squandered the opportunity. By the time the men moved inland, the Ottomans had rushed reinforcements to the ridges. Another chance to break free was buried in blood and indecision. By autumn, Gallipoli was no longer a campaign of hope, but of endurance. Letters home from Anzac soldiers spoke of flies, filth, and the constant taste of death. "The smell of this place," one Australian wrote, "will never leave my memory." The men were gaunt and hollow-eyed, shadows of the young soldiers who had stormed the beaches in April. Gallipoli had become a prison without walls, and winter was coming. Winter arrived on Gallipoli like a cruel executioner. The heat and stench of summer were replaced by bitter winds, freezing rain, and mud that swallowed boots and claimed the weak. Soldiers who had endured months of constant shelling and disease now faced frostbite and hypothermia. The trenches, already shallow and miserable, became rivers of icy sludge. Rifles froze in the men's hands, and the chill cut through wet uniforms like knives. For the Anzacs, British and French forces, the dream of victory had long died. Gallipoli was no longer a campaign. It was a slow bleed. Men clung to life in dugouts, lined with sandbags and scraps of wood, listening to the distant echo of artillery. Each day brought a new round of sickness. Dysentery and typhoid spread like fire in the crowded trenches, and rats fed on the dead in the no-man's land. The Ottomans suffered just as greatly. Their rations were poor, and the cold was merciless. Yet their resolve never wavered. They were fighting for their homeland, for the soil beneath their feet, and under Mustafa Kemal's command, their defense remained unbroken. Even as snow dusted the hills of the peninsula, their soldiers held the ridges, looking down on the enemy with grim determination. By December 1915, the Allied command finally accepted the truth. Gallipoli was a lost cause. The peninsula could not be taken. Tens of thousands had died for a few miles of barren ground. The evacuation was planned in utmost secrecy. The soldiers who had suffered so long now faced the most dangerous moment of the entire campaign, retreating silently under the nose of the enemy. In the dead of night, troops slipped away to the beaches. Equipment was left behind, and rifles were rigged to fire automatically with dripping water to mask the disappearance. One by one, the boats carried them off the cursed shores. By the morning of January 9th, 1916, the last Allied soldier had left Gallipoli. Against all odds, the evacuation was a success. Not a single man was lost in the retreat. But the cost of Gallipoli was carved into history. Over 250,000 Allied soldiers were killed or wounded, and the Ottoman Empire suffered a similar toll. For Australia and New Zealand, Gallipoli became a crucible of national identity, a story of courage and sacrifice that birthed the Anzac legend. For the Ottomans, it was proof that their homeland could still defy the great powers of the world. Gallipoli was a campaign of suffering, heroism, and futility. A place where young men from across the globe met death on a narrow strip of land far from home. A place where history was written in blood, and the echoes of their sacrifice still whisper across the windswept ridges. By late May 1915, Gallipoli had become a graveyard of shattered hopes. The Anzac soldiers clung to the narrow strip of beach and the cliffs above, their positions barely holding under the relentless Ottoman fire. Every inch of the trench was soaked with mud, sweat, and blood. The air carried the stench of unburied dead, for neither side could risk exposure to recover bodies under the rifles and machine guns aimed from above. Life in the trenches was a daily torment. Lice crawled in their uniforms, disease spread through unclean water, and rations often consisted of hard biscuits and tin bully beef that tasted of rot under the searing Mediterranean sun. The men, many barely out of school, wrote letters home filled with both hope and despair. Some spoke of mateship and courage, others whispered of nightmares they could never forget. The Ottomans, defending their homeland, suffered the same hell. Ottoman soldiers, many from Anatolia, held the high ground and endured relentless naval shelling and the scarcity of supplies. They dug in with the same determination, knowing that surrender was death and failure would open the door to the enemy's advance toward Istanbul. Both sides realized by June that this would not be the quick, glorious campaign the politicians had promised. The peninsula had become a static battlefield of attrition. Every night was a contest of fear, raiding parties, sniper fire, and the deafening roar of artillery echoing across the ridges. As the summer heat descended, flies swarmed the trenches, disease spread like wildfire, and morale began to rot. Yet, amidst the horror, the soldiers held on. Anzac soldiers carved out an identity, and the Ottoman defenders, inspired by commanders like Mustafa Kemal, gained confidence that they could resist the great empires. By August 1915, the Gallipoli Campaign had stalled. The Allied command knew that a breakthrough was needed, and they turned to a bold plan. A massive offensive aimed at capturing the Sari Bear Ridge, the high ground that dominated the Anzac positions and the Dardanelles beyond. The plan was ambitious. Fresh troops, mostly inexperienced from Britain and Ireland, would land at Suvla Bay to the north. Meanwhile, Anzac forces would strike toward Chunuk Bair and Hill 971, vital peaks along the ridge. If they could seize the heights, the Ottoman defences might finally collapse. On the night of August 6, 1915, the offensive began under a moonless sky. Anzac soldiers, exhausted but determined, crept out of their trenches and climbed the steep, thorn-covered slopes of Gallipoli. The air was filled with whispered orders, the crunch of boots on dry soil, and the distant rumble of naval guns offshore. At Chunuk Bair, the New Zealanders made a daring push, briefly capturing the summit. From the peak, soldiers could see the Dardanelles glinting in the distance, a symbol of the victory that had seemed so elusive. But holding the position was another matter. Ottoman counterattacks, led in part by Mustafa Kemal himself, crashed against the exhausted defenders. Wave after wave of soldiers surged through the gullies, and by the end of the day, the ridge ran red with blood. Meanwhile, the landings at Suvla Bay turned into a disaster. Confusion, poor leadership, and hesitation allowed the Ottomans to reinforce their positions. Soldiers waded ashore through knee-deep water and stumbled into a maze of sand dunes and scrubland, unsure where to advance. By the time they organized, the moment of surprise was gone. The opportunity to break the deadlock slipped away. The August offensive cost thousands of lives but achieved little. By mid-month, the heat returned, water was scarce, and corpses littered the slopes. Men wrote in their diaries of flies so thick you could barely open your mouth without swallowing them, and of the sinking realization that this campaign had become a slaughter with no end in sight. Gallipoli was now a campaign of endurance. Both sides knew the peninsula would not be taken by a single glorious charge, but by the grinding misery of months more in the trenches. By the autumn of 1915, Gallipoli had become a place of unrelenting misery. Months of stalemate had transformed the once daring campaign into a nightmare of heat, disease, and death. Trenches reeked of unburied bodies. The cries of the wounded echoed through the gullies at night, mingling with the whine of insects and the distant boom of artillery. Water was life, and yet it was scarce. Soldiers drank from stagnant, muddy pools, risking dysentery with every sip. Supplies came slowly, often under the threat of shellfire from Ottoman guns positioned high on the ridges. Letters home spoke of a world reduced to dust, flies, and death. Despite the grim conditions, the Ottoman defenders, led by the now legendary Mustafa Kemal, remained unbroken. They clung to the heights with ferocious determination, repelling every Allied attempt to gain ground. Their resolve turned the campaign into a symbol of defiance for the Ottoman Empire and a proving ground for the soldiers who would one day fight for the Turkish Republic. For the Allies, British, French, Australian, New Zealand, and others, the realization came late but clear. Gallipoli could not be won. The August offensive had failed and winter was approaching. Mud and cold would replace heat and flies, and the narrow beaches offered no protection from the storms. In December 1915, the decision was made: the Allies would withdraw. The evacuation of Anzac Cove and Suvla Bay was a masterpiece of quiet precision. Soldiers tiptoed to the boats under the cover of night, leaving rifles rigged to fire automatically so the Ottomans would think the trenches were still manned. Not a single life was lost in the evacuation itself. A bitter irony after 8 months of slaughter. When the last troops slipped away in January 1916, Gallipoli was left to its dead. Over 250,000 casualties on each side, killed, wounded, or missing, marked the campaign as one of the most futile tragedies of the First World War. Yet Gallipoli lived on in memory. For Australia and New Zealand, the Anzac legend was born in the crucible of defeat. For Turkey, the defense of the Dardanelles became a symbol of national pride and the rise of Mustafa Kemal, the future Atatürk. And for Britain and its allies, Gallipoli became a lesson in the terrible cost of overconfidence and the unforgiving nature of modern war. The beaches and ridges of Gallipoli remain silent today, but beneath the earth lie the echoes of those who came, fought, and never returned. It was not just a battle. It was a reckoning.